Just this week, the incredible fifth part of the Astartes series was released and reached number 4 on YouTube trending, an incredible achievement for a 40k video. This whole series has been incredibly rich with 40k lore and one of the best representations of Space Marines in animation ever. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today, let's go through the entire Astartes series and do an in-depth analysis of all the awesome details that the creator jammed in to this gorgeous series. And before we begin, obviously, spoiler alert for the series, if you haven't watched it yet, go to YouTube and look up Astartes and get it done. The whole thing's like 15 minutes, so, I mean, honestly, what are you waiting for? So right at the start of the first video, we have some opening crawl. A lot of the stuff in the series is homebrew and doesn't really have an analog in official canon. So both the Argosa Uprising and the Retributor Space Marine chapter were invented by the creator, but he did invent a little bit of background for these guys that we'll talk about later. The ship we see in the first shot is actually a Cobra-class torpedo destroyer. Usually it's used by the Imperial Navy, but also by Marine fleets as shown in the series, because it is small enough to adhere to the Codex Astartes, which disallows the Marines' use of any heavy combat ships. Because it is a Marine ship, the personnel that we see in the next shot are most likely chapter serfs. Almost all of the crew on a Marine vessel are either servitors or serfs, which are basically dropouts from the Marine application process. As a side note, this is why Marine ships are usually so difficult to board, since all the human crew are extremely highly trained and conditioned from childhood. In canon, most serfs are described as robed, but I really like the effort to make the crew seem a little bit more realistic by outfitting them in believable military gear in the series. Now, in the very background of this next shot, we see a robed figure cross the other hall on the far end from where the Marines are. Now, we don't know who this character is, and if they are a chapter affiliated, it's likely that they're a chaplain or something similar, but I think that it's the Inquisitor that we see later on in the series. Next, we see the Marines praying and consecrating their weapons, and finally boarding their assault ram. Now, I did a ton of digging and couldn't find a boarding ship design that matches the flat top of the squad's delivery vehicle in the series, so it's reasonable to assume that it's a type of gun cutter that the creator designed specifically for his custom chapter. Inside the dropship, we can see a close-up of the arrows on the Marines' helmets, which designate them as an impulsor squad, basically a super tactical squad specific to the Retributors chapter that acts as autonomous special forces. Makes sense since this squad would be boarding an enemy ship without any support from assault or devastator teams. So the first thing we see in part 2 is a Thunderbolt heavy fighter escorting the Marines into the asteroids before breaking off, probably to head off some enemy strike craft. Despite the fact that they're usually seen as aircraft in the tabletop game, they can use rocket engines that we see here in place of their turbofans to fly in a vacuum. Next up, 2 autonomous drones break off to detonate incoming missiles fired by the traitor ship, and a las cannon turret extends and blows up the remaining missiles. This is a little addition to the lore that I absolutely love. The logic of boarding actions in sci-fi universes always seemed a little shaky, and with the size of ships in 40k, it always seemed like point defensives would be nearly impenetrable. Strikecraft and boarding torpedoes are often used because of their ability to penetrate void shields, unlike teleporters, but sending in valuable Astartes and just hoping that ship-to-ship missiles and turrets wouldn't destroy them always seemed a little janky to me, so I loved that the creator added this nod to point defenses in his series. Unfortunately, I have no idea what the Rebel ship is. It doesn't follow the armored, proud design of any Imperial ship, so it's likely just a retrofit civilian ship or something like that, which also might help explain how easily the Marine craft got so close. Once it does, we can see that the Marine ship uses the las cannons mounted at its turret and a third, heavier beam from deeper in the chassis to cut through the target's hull. On the Rebel uniforms inside the craft, we see a starburst shape inside a circle that is reminiscent of the spheres and their occupants that we see in the final part of the series. Maybe the humans painted them on as part of their cult worship? The next shot we see is from the Marines' auto senses, which highlight the heat signatures of the guardsmen waiting for them. And the squad comes out gunplay. From their return fire, we can see that these rebels are using auto guns, whereas later in the series, we see guardsmen using las guns, which indicates a lack of standardization in the rebel forces. So I don't have a ton to say about this section, but I do love the addition of the ammo readouts in the back of the Marines' bolt guns here. Here we see the Rebels using a combination of las guns, a heavy stubber, and a missile launcher, maybe indicating that these guys are a little bit more elite than the auto gun equipped Rebels that we saw earlier. This is an awesome design for a team crewed autocannon emplacement, and really gives the Marines pause. Next up, we see another crew surf weapon. This is a multi-laser this time. Some people have referred to it as a las cannon, but it's definitely a multi-laser. It is more of a rapid-fire, lighter version of a las cannon, which also helps explain why it has trouble penetrating the Marine's power armor. This unfortunate soul was trying to apply a demolition charge to the Marine Sergeant, but ate a combat knife for his trouble. I also love the touch here of the bolters leaving only half of a Rebel soldier left. We do have to remember that these are basically grenade launchers. A piece of continuity that I love is that the multi-laser impacts leave craters on the Sergeant's armor that remain that way for the rest of the series. Now, who the Psychers and the Spheres are in this series is one of the biggest questions that Astartes has left us, and that's definitely something I'm going to talk about later in the video, and potentially in a future video. Now, this scene is one of my favorites because I think it's one of the only places that accurately depicts how fast Marines are described to be. Most of the official animations show them as plodding brutes, even though Canon Prose describes them as being inhumanly fast and agile, just like in this scene. We can also see the bolt gun shells that are caught in the Psychers' telekinetic fields, with their rockets still activated and detonating just after impact in midair. This is another awesome depiction of exactly how bolters are described in the fluff, even though a lot of times their actual function isn't shown that well. Here we can also see the Psychers blasting away the Marines that are shooting at them, although as we see later in the series, these attacks don't actually incapacitate any of them. The sequence here can be a little bit confusing to some people. It looks like the Psycher crushes the Sergeant's eye inside his helmet, but in reality, he's only able to pop out the outer layer of the helmet's lens. This gives us a clearer view of the helmet's auto-sense display inside the lens, and helps differentiate the Sergeant more in later scenes from his comrades. One of the other Impulsor Squad members is able to use that superhuman speed we talked about earlier to surprise one of the Psychers, giving the Sergeant the chance to kill the Psycher that he's engaged with. We can see in the corners here that the rest of the Impulsor Squad has survived as they approach the final door, and off-screen it's assumed that the Sergeant retrieves his plasma pistol that he dropped earlier, because he has it in future scenes. But with that, we are off to the climactic part 5 of the series. And this one's a doozy. So the first shot we see is of a Space Marine strike cruiser and what looks like a Dominator-class Imperial cruiser. The Dominator is not a ship permitted to be used by Space Marine chapters, and that may indicate that it's the ship of the Inquisitor that we see later. Clearly the interior design is different of that from the Cobra Destroyer that we saw earlier, which was very brightly lit, whereas this is much darker and covered in purity seals. This scene also gives us our first glimpse of the Restrained Sphere, one of 2 we see in the series, and the Inquisitor is linked to it through some sort of psychic device. The Retributor's captain and his lieutenant have come to visit the Inquisitor as their Impulsor team nears the location of the second sphere on the Rebel ship. It's clear that the Impulsor's mission was to link the sphere on the Rebel ship to the Inquisitor's apparatus using the psychic spikes we see later, and the captain and the lieutenant have come to oversee the Inquisitor while this process is completed. Back on the Rebel ship, we see the Sergeant with his broken helmet lens enter the other sphere's chamber, and he crushes some sort of crystal with his boot. It's likely that this is just ice, and psychic powers in 40k are described as rapidly lowering the ambient temperature and creating hoarfrost on the ground. One little touch here I love is the exhaust fumes coming out of the Marines' backpacks as they enter the chamber. Inside the chamber we see some pretty weird stuff, including this giant golden robot thingy surrounding what looks like floating servo skulls, but are actually the golden masks and spinal cords worn by the Psychers in the previous room. As we see later in the Inquisitor's vision, it's the Sphere's intention to create a lot more of these Psychers, so it stands to reason that they'd have more of these devices awaiting suitable hosts. Deeper inside the room, we see the second Sphere and get the first spoken words of the whole series.
Astartes.
The words are a warning. Astartes, get back. The Sphere attacks the Marines, pushing them away with pulses of force, and even appears to attempt to influence the mind of the Sergeant, who is able to shake off its attack. Undeterred, the Marines advance and plunge devices into the Sphere, which appear to subdue its power. As we talked about earlier, the prevailing theory is that these stakes allow the Inquisitor back on the other ship to read the Spheres communicating with one another. Back on the ship, we return to the Inquisitor, who is privy to a conversation between the two Spheres. The audio is epically distorted, but to the best of my knowledge, the conversation goes something like this. At this point, the Inquisitor looks startled and yells something to the Astartes that sounds like, "Get them out of there." The Sphere then follows up its conversation with the words, "Unless he can," and sends a pulse of energy into the Inquisitor. This is clearly hazardous for his health, as he sees a horrific vision of the Sphere's intentions, including creating more of the Psychers that we saw earlier, and melting all the Space Marines' faces off, before he fails the perils of the warp test, and the Marine captain and his lieutenant have to do their best Commissar impression. We see a couple interesting things in these visions. The planet that the Marines are on looks similar to the Skeletal Valley at the end of the episode, but this version appears different. The position of the statues is different, with the adorned skeletons appearing at the top of the valley rather than the bottom, and the environment is volcanic rather than deserted. Maybe a vision of the location from the past before it was dead and abandoned. The Marines also appear to be stripped down. Their armor is missing its shoulder pads, backpacks, and helmets, perhaps indicating that they are prisoners being executed. Back on the Rebel ship, we see the Sergeant react to a message in his Vox. Clearly, the captain's aide got a message out to them, but it was too late and the Sphere reawakens. Inside the Sphere, we see its occupant, or true form, a golden mask, but this time it's Baroque and covered in intricate designs and trailing tentacles. Interesting that it appears similar to the masks worn by the Psychers, but its designs are highly deliberate rather than being a coral-like texture. The Sphere then begins pulling the Marines in. The Sergeant overloads his plasma pistol and fails his Gets Hot roll and blows his hand off. And inside the Sphere, we see the bronze occupant from earlier grabbing hold of the entire Impulsor squad with its tendrils. The Sergeant is then teleported to another desert location and rips his helmet off to vomit blood. We can see the blood congealing on the ground due to his Laramine cells, which I think was an awesome detail to include. And underneath its helmet, we can also see the interfaces of his black carapace. In the spooky last shot of the episode, we see the Sergeant in an alien valley surrounded by enormous skeletons. The skeletons in the front are reminiscent of the bronze vision inside the Sphere, only skeletal and have protrusions attached to the back of their necks, similar to the Psychers from earlier. The skeletons behind them have covered faces and no accoutrements, suggesting that they are slaves like the humans on the ship. On the small pillars around the Marine, we see flashes, Given that there's no sense of scale, these could be other rock surfaces like the one that the Sergeant is on, and the flashes could represent the rest of his squad being teleported to the same planet. That ends the final episode of the Astartes series and leaves us with more questions than we started with, but like any good cinematic universe, we also get an after-credit scene. In the outro credits, we see the Astartes logo image switch rapidly between several different Marine chapters, starting with a member of the Angels Sanguine, a Blood Angel successor, and switching to 2 new chapters I can't identify, which may also be homebrews. A black armored Marine with a white faceplate featuring the image of a coiled serpent or dragon, and a yellow armored Marine with a black helmet and backpack featuring the image of a skeletal hand. The scene continues, showing the Marines struck by some form of shard weaponry. The blue glow makes it appear similar to Tau pulse fire, but we can see shards embedded in the Marines' armor, potentially shuriken or splinter weapon fire. The trooper jumps away to reveal burning buildings in the background and a Predator Destructor sporting the same skeletal hand symbol firing its autocannon. So that's it, folks. That's the entirety of the Astartes series, and like I said before, it's left us with more unanswered questions. Who are the Psychers and the Spheres? What was the meaning of the Inquisitor's vision? Where was the Impulsor squad transported to? Who are the massive skeletons on the desert planet? And, most importantly, when is the next Astartes video coming out? If you guys enjoyed this style of more lore-heavy content, go ahead and give the video a like and let me know down in the comments, and I'll cover some potential answers to those questions in a future video. Although, probably not that last question, that's up to the Astartes creator. But I'm sure some more support on his Patreon wouldn't hurt in making it come out a little sooner. I'll drop a link down below in the description. Remember to drop a subscribe, check out Tactical Tortoise and Astartes on Patreon, and as always, have happy wargaming, folks.